From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's episode is the story of Blondie. From a crumbling New York of the mid-'70s, in a tiny downtown club on the edge of collapse, a sound began to cut through the noise and redefine what popular music could be. One of those bands, Blondie, fronted by a punk-era Marilyn Monroe, fused art, New York street cool, visual invention, and razor-sharp pop songwriting, fearlessly moving between punk, new wave, rock, disco, reggae, and rap to climb from the underground to the top of the charts in the late 1970s and early 80s with a slew of number one hits and over 40 million albums sold. In this episode, you'll discover how a collapsing New York City birthed a new sound, how the lead singer Debbie Harry rose as punk's most magnetic icon, how Debbie and Chris Stein, a guitarist for the band, created a creative and romantic partnership, how Blondie brought rap into mainstream pop culture, and how the sudden collapse of the band ended their first golden era. Joining us today to discuss Blondie is Fred Schruers. Fred is a former Rolling Stone magazine staff writer who has contributed to the Washington Post, the LA Times, and he appeared on our Story of Billy Joel episode. He's here today to discuss Blondie, a band he profiled in Rolling Stone in the 70s and 80s time period, and the subject of a biography he wrote about hanging out with the band in that seminal period. Welcome back to Garage to Stadiums, Fred.
Nice to be back. I'm happy to be here.
You were at Rolling Stone when Blondie was up and coming. What do you recall about that era?
Certainly so. There was all that punk energy, right? We're talking 76 to 78 was really an explosion down at CBGB's. I mean, not to go into Patti Smith land all of a sudden, but where you could stand outside CBGB's and Patti was about to perform as a trio and you would offer a hit of a hash pipe. And she would say then, gee, I like hash, but it might numb my throat a little bit, so I better not.
Were you offering her the hash or she offering you?
Myself and another little preppy-looking idiot from the suburbs, she must have thought, where are my punks? Who are these kids? But we did have the hash, which we proceeded to enjoy the concert beyond. Anyhow, kids, don't do what we did. Just stay straight. I had seen Blondie maybe once or twice. They were a coming phenomenon. They still weren't that big a noise. I think it was a 1,400-word feature in Rolling Stone at Tops that was assigned to me. I was just a sprout around the office. I hadn't done cover stories yet or anything like that. So send him over there. And we meet at Trader Vic's, which, of course, is in New York. I consider it a dark subterranean place. It's in the bottom floor of the Plaza Hotel. And we commenced drinking, I think, Samoan fog cutters. And we realized we were all going to get along about 2 fog cutters in. And I did the interview, which made the fuel for the Rolling Stone feature that would soon appear. And they said, come on by. Maybe we'll smoke one in our apartment. So we walk across 57th Street and up to the penthouse of a building at 58th Street. It happened to be the building where Kate Simon, the great photographer of the era who took all those great Bob Marley pictures, she lived in that building. So David Johansen would always be there visiting people. The Clash crashed on Kate's floor in that building, things like that. So stupidly enough, I proceeded to wall walk a little bit on the edge of the 8 stories. And then we sat and we had a good time. And it became, I don't want to call it a friendship, I'd probably be exaggerating, but a professional association with friendly benefits.
Blondie lead singer Debbie Harry was born Angela Trimble on July 1st, 1945 in Miami, Florida. At 3 months old, she was adopted by Richard and Catherine Harry, who renamed her Deborah Ann Harry and raised her in the small town in New Jersey. She learned she was adopted at age 4. Her birth parents were of Scottish ancestry, carrying the surnames Trimble and Mackenzie.
She grew up in Fair Lawn, New Jersey. That's in the northwest, Bergen County. It's a very sedate, these are bedroom communities. Fair Lawn was a fairly high median income. Her family were working middle class. She didn't really talk much about her own origin story going back that far. A cheerleader, majorette, that sort of person. People spotted her right away as the focus in any room. Just the cheekbones, the blonde hair, though at the time it was often magenta.
As a teenager growing up in New Jersey, Debbie Harry was pulled toward the energy and danger of nearby New York City and its evolving music scene. She fell in love with the smoky, melancholy tunes of Miles Davis and Billie Holiday, while also absorbing the edgy counterculture sounds of the Velvet Underground and early rock vocal groups that foreshadowed the downtown punk explosion. But Harry's biggest obsession wasn't a musician at all. It was Marilyn Monroe. In her autobiography, entitled Face It, Debbie admits to a fascination with Monroe's image and mythology. She even fantasized that the Hollywood icon might be her biological mother. That fixation helped shape the unforgettable Blondie persona she later created. Bleach blonde glamour fused with toughness, sexuality, and punk aggression. Blondie guitarist Chris Stein grew up in Brooklyn in a secular communist Jewish household where religion was rejected, though he retained a cultural link to his grandfather's Yiddish-speaking roots. And in a Jewish Chronicle interview, he noted his parents even named him Chris to help soften anti-Semitic assumptions of his surname Stein. Seeing the Velvet Underground live in 1967 left a lasting imprint on his sense of music as art, noise, and attitude. From there, he immersed himself in the Greenwich Village folk scene, regularly taking the subway into Washington Square Park and the surrounding streets to hear performers like Richie Havens playing live in public spaces. As a young rock and roll fan, he even attended Woodstock in 1969. He was fascinated by the explosive raw power of Jimi Hendrix and the Rolling Stones. And that collision of art rock, folk authenticity, and electric stadium rock became the foundation of Blondie's sound and attitude. So how did Debbie and Chris come together? Well, before Blondie existed, Debbie Harry and Chris Stein first crossed paths in a group called the Stilettos, a wildly theatrical downtown act built on 1960s girl group harmonies, retro fashion, drag show energy, and offbeat pop culture camp. It was glamorous, stylized, and deliberately artificial. But Stein, when he joined, brought the darker influence of the Velvet Underground and the gritty New York sound, pushing for louder guitars and more danger in the music. And Debbie immediately connected with that harder edge. When Stein was fired over growing creative tension, Debbie walked out with him. Within months, the pair transformed that collision of glamour, irony, and downtown grit into Blondie, a band that would help redefine pop and punk style. Let's go to Chris Stein and Debbie Harry's relationship, because I think that's interesting. She's of that earlier era of rock. She's several years older than Chris. How did they sort of come together and form sort of this, I guess it would be a partnership on many levels?
Yeah, well, the Goethe phrase is elective affinity, because the affinity was there. He's a good-looking, bushy-haired guy, lean guitar player, hero, offbeat, Brooklyn-esque hero, but still, so he's an attractive dude. She's obviously the prettiest girl downtown, or maybe all the way up to 57th Street. And I think it was just honest animal attraction.
Next, Debbie Harry is the victim of a violent sexual assault in New York City.
Garage to Stadiums, part of the top 5% of podcasts globally.
Mid-1970s New York was a city teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, crime rising, infrastructure failing, and whole stretches of Manhattan feeling increasingly abandoned. The dangerous city vibe hit particularly hard for Debbie Harry and Chris Stein prior to getting Blondie off the ground. During this period, they were victims of a violent home invasion in New York. Both were restrained and Debbie was sexually assaulted. She later reflected on the experience and said not only was the assault traumatic, but equally challenged was the devastating loss of their instruments and equipment at a time when they were struggling to survive as working musicians in the downtown scene. And these were the only assets they owned. And out of that mid-1970s New York pressure cooker came a raw, harder-edge music scene that would later be coined proto-punk. Loud, stripped-down rock where guitars drove the sound, vocals turned abrasive, and the lyrics often reflected street life, violence, and urban despair. The term proto in proto-punk comes from the Greek word protos, meaning first or original. The idea being that these bands were the blueprint for what punk would soon become. At CBGB, that sound took shape through bands like the New York Dolls and the Ramones. The Dolls, briefly managed by Malcolm McLaren, who would later apply their aesthetic blueprint to the Sex Pistols, helped define the look and attitude. Then, in July 1976, the Ramones played in London, a pivotal moment witnessed by future members of The Clash, Chrissie Hynde, who would go on to form The Pretenders, and members of the British punk group The Damned. Within weeks, the British punk explosion followed, ignited in part by what they had seen and heard that night. Joining the Ramones as regulars at CBGB in New York were Talking Heads, Television, Patti Smith, and Blondie. In the Talking Heads episode, Fred, New York City of the 1976-77, this is a city that's bankrupt. We talked about how the actual loss of industry, how that opened up a whole art scene because these people could live cheaply in these warehouses in lower Manhattan, that spawned a lot of these groups, obviously CBGB. What was it like to go down there in that era?
It was great. If you took a regular 7-Eleven store, it was not much bigger than that. And the bathroom was in the back, like in the 7-Eleven. And they didn't have a magnetometer to see if you were bringing a gun into the place. Nobody was bringing a gun into CBGB. There wasn't a velvet rope where some guy, some idiot was going to tell you you're okay to go into CBGB. It's a dark, noisy, sticky floors with beer room. If you go in the backstage, they really didn't want you there. Second of all, there's not enough seating. Third of all, your brain is completely fogged by the amount of stickers and graffiti on the wall. It's just a dense environment. Cram yourself in there. But then maybe you're brave enough to get where there might be a little spit flying and actually get down in a squat right in front of the stage. And Richard Hell is swinging his bass around, right? And you might get clocked. And it couldn't be more fun, you know? Joey Ramone is there, you know that stance? But Joey Ramone is there belting it down 3 feet from your head. And Dee Dee is going to fall over. You know, every band was excitement. There was a sense of belonging. How did I get in this mood? You know?
Tell us where Blondie sat in that, I'll call it the food chain of CBGB groupings of bands that included the Ramones, Talking Heads, Television, Patti Smith. What would sort of the position of Blondie be among all those?
Well, that's the right question because they are a little bit to the side. We're the girl front person. So as charismatic as Tom Verlaine might be, you know, in television, if you want to add a category, they were popish. So I'd say they were occupied the respected middle, you know.
What was it like to see Blondie in that environment at CBGB's?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're not more than 30 feet from the band. And they're a little bit crowded in, which only makes her project more. Because in a way, it's very democratizing. You don't have the drummer buried. He's 5 feet away, too. I was hoping, God, don't let her make eye contact with me because I'm a little bit afraid of her. I'm afraid that my eyes are bugged out, not at the sheer attractiveness. I'm afraid that she's going to zap me with her magic charisma. That's how I think she made everyone in the room feel that way. And that still would work in an arena. So that's Debbie's secret, I think. And Chris knew enough to find that and bring it forward. Warhol was a huge influence. He loved the punks, you know. He would be at Max's Kansas City all the time. Chris was saying to me as early on as that Rolling Stone piece, we don't want to go out and beat ourselves to death on the road. We're going to use the media. The media is there begging to be used. So you had many little islands that formed a pretty interesting archipelago of we're still punks. And Blondie definitely still got all the respect. They got the punk magazine and the trouser press coverage, just like any respectable, so to speak, punk
Well, you
band.
mentioned something that's very interesting there, because Blondie is just a much a visual phenomenon as a musical one. How did the downtown art and film scene, you mentioned Warhol, it shaped their band's aesthetic?
Oh, sure. Platinum blonde hair, you're going to go to an extreme. It doesn't hurt to have Marlene Dietrich cheekbones. She dressed for the punk scene rather tastefully, and I don't know if you want to use the word discreetly, but she wasn't selling the body, so to speak. It was choreographed to her, and Chris had style, and Jimmy Destry is pretty good looking keyboardist who has a ton of skills and could already start to produce. Jimmy would play synthesizer and pretty much give you what sound you wanted to replicate. So if you wanted a little bit of cheesy, almost Farfisa style organ, wanted something Dave Clark 5, he could do that on the synthesizer. And they said, this gives us a lot of room, elbow room, sonically, because they always made pretty well layered records. And of course, Clem was just a steady center. Clem, to say you can't talk about Blondie, it's like talking about The Who without Keith Moon, without talking about Clem. Obviously, Keith had a lot of skin, right? He played a lot of notes. He played busily, but he played with power and played with a heavy bottom sometimes and great on the snare. Not exactly a guy riding the cymbals too delicately, but ultimately, Clem, a great, powerful drummer. They were in the hands of very seasoned musicianly producers.
Blondie, December 76, their first album had Ex-Offender, The Flesh, Ripper to Shreds. The first release got good reviews in the Rolling Stone magazine, and In the Flesh went to number 2 in Australia, their first commercial success, which kind of reinforces something we'll talk about later, is how they were accepted overseas almost, adopted by other countries, even more so than the US. What was Debbie Harry's on-stage persona? Was Marilyn Monroe an influence, do you think?
Yeah, I'm a little remote. I'm a little troubled. She had an aura that was unmistakable, and mystery was definitely a component. But she was also had kind of crafty little funny one-liners. So she could chatter just enough with the audience, and she would be flirty. And
Right.
in one-on-one personal interactions, she would have been embarrassed to be flirty. And part of it was the reserve. So just she knew how to deploy her presence.
The second album, February 1978, Plastic Letters,
Sure.
Denis, I'm Always Touched by Your Presence, Dear, and Kidnapper. Why do you think they covered that song, Denis? I mean, that's a 1963 song.
It makes me think of Claudine Lange, the French balladeer. He had a liking for French pop. Why?
Like the new wave film kind of like...
Yeah, that was part of it. Chris was a little bit of an intellectual.
So they were pretty intellectual. I mean, we don't think of them in the same light as the Talking Heads, who are the Rhode Island School of Design graduates. But Blondie, I mean, you talked about the depth of the thinking on these people. Like Chris was a smart dude. Debbie was smart, no pushover. They were pretty, how should I call it, savvy as well.
They were that. And if you think about Life During Wartime by the Talking Heads, that's kind of why we're afraid to walk in the street. But if you think about Blondie making songs around that time, it's more, no, come into the little boîte, come into the little nightclub and watch Marlene Dietrich lay some tunes on you. There was more an inner circle feeling to Blondie. So they were sort of, everyone had them close to their chest. It's a little different than any other punkish band.
Next, the band's hard work pays off as they release a chart-topping album and singles.
Kick back, relax, and enjoy your trip from the garage to global stadiums.
Parallel Lines album, 1978. It contained Heart of Glass, One Way or Another, Hanging on the Telephone. It was a massive breakthrough in the US and internationally. The album went to number 1 in the UK, number 6 in the US. Heart of Glass hits number 1 in both countries. One Way or Another peaks at number 1 in the UK and number 6 in the US. UK seemed to be ahead of the US in terms of accepting this band and loving it.
Yeah, they really were. Again, They're attuned to show business in a way I don't think we are. They're used to getting their music from America. Okay, they beat us to the glorification of the blues players who so deserved it. They were quick to discover things first. And I think the band was now playing slightly roomier, greater population halls over in England. So instead of playing to 75 people crammed into CBGBs, they could go do some larger venues. Here's the pretty girl. Here's the band. Those songs you just named, which one of those is not a banger, right? Of some sort. They are hugely appealing pop records. And here's a girl who sometimes she's Marlene Dietrich and sometimes she's Cheryl's influence. And I remember riding downtown in a limo to go to some photo shoot they were going to. And we passed the Broadway theater and it's Ain't Misbehavin'. And she just rocks out Ain't Misbehavin' like, I don't know, like a 75-year-old, large, powerful, beautiful black woman would sing Ain't Misbehavin', you know. I thought, wow.
Did you get a sense when you hung out with them that Debbie was different on stage than she was in person? Like, was it a different person, different character?
Not so much. I think she was authentically that thing. She'd already put her toe in the water as a commercial entity of some sort, and she was an also-ran. She's going to be stage front, you know.
Debbie Harry didn't just create a look, she created one of the first fully self-aware pop identities of the modern music era. Emerging from the downtown New York scene around CBGBs in the mid-1970s, Debbie fused together old Hollywood glamour, punk rebellion, pop art, thrift art fashion, underground film culture, and comic book exaggeration into something entirely new. The biggest visual influence was, as we said, Marilyn Monroe. The platinum blonde hair, the bombshell image, the idea of celebrity itself as performance. But Debbie added irony, danger, and New York street toughness. She wasn't trying to look natural. She was trying to look iconic. Her new blonde hairdo even inspired the name of her band. Truck drivers would routinely yell, "Hey, Blondie," to her in the street. She took the term and empowering herself and her bandmates with it, suggesting it as the name of a fearless band that could conquer the charts. Her band and romantic partner, Blondie guitarist Chris Stein, played a major role with her in shaping the band's visual identity through photography, art direction, and deep connections to underground art culture. Around them was the lingering influence of Andy Warhol and the factory scene, where image, fame, and artificiality were treated as art forms themselves. What made Debbie revolutionary was that she embraced glamour at a time when punk often rejected it. She took the language of celebrity, exaggerated it, and turned it into something both seductive and subversive. In many ways, Debbie Harry helped invent the modern blueprint for the female pop star, influencing artists from Madonna to Gwen Stefani to Lady Gaga, proving that image itself could be a form of artistic expression.
To your point, yeah, they brought an era where Joan Jett isn't 1,000 yards away from Debbie on stage, you know. She was just a little more, I'm going to do this in a macho way. Debbie was, I'm going to do this in a feminine way, but I will step on your hands if you get too close to my monitor kind of way.
Right. The 1979 album, Eat to the Beat, was where we talk about the Dreaming song. I mean, that song, like you said, was their early vision. It comes to life in this album. And that album hit number 1 in the UK, number 17 in the US. Single Dreaming hits number 2 in the UK. So this was kind of a key album. That song was huge.
Absolutely. And again, you feel a story, you feel a narrative, you know, perking underneath it pretty straightforwardly. So again, they meet and they're both dreaming of something, which would be tour America or don't tour America. Just use what we have going in the studio and in our image and do some crucial gigs and put some videos out. She knew how to be a front person, and the band was happy to yield that part of the stage to her. They're not going to tuck her away.
Let's talk about February 1980. I mean, talk about putting out a hit with the help of Giorgio Moroder. Moroder was the so-called father of disco. His work with analog synthesizers and drum machines on tracks like Donna Summer's 77 hit I Feel Love laid the foundational blueprint for modern house, techno, synth pop, and he was asked to compose and produce the entire musical score for the 1980 film American Gigolo starring Richard Gere. And initially they went to Stevie Nicks to do the song Call Me, and she apparently didn't like the lyrics at the time. They were very sexual, and they approached Debbie, and she said, we'll do it. And away they went. And she actually contributed to the lyrics of that. That's the unknown story that I did some research on.
I'm interested to hear all that, yeah.
It was not a finished song. Like, Moroder had other lyrics, and Debbie said, these are too literal. Like, we can make them better.
That's a really smart call on her part, and absolutely fits into the sort of portrait we're building of her, which is, I know enough to show some attraction, but I'm not going to sell it to you cheaply. You figure me out. I'll be a little bit of a mystery. Call Me, and that movie summed up an era of, I don't know, self-glorification, but also a sort of deadliness lurking in the urban elites. It was just the right time at the right place. And of course, by then, they'd been all the fancy discos. They saw the response of the people in the disco.
Next, Blondie proves its experimental side and introduces the first incidences of rap music to mainstream audiences. It's interesting how this band Blondie, using the November 80 album where they start to do The Tide is High, Rapture, The Tide is High, which is obviously a rock steady cover from a Jamaican group. The Paragons that did it in 1967. Blondie was so open to other styles. They didn't stick in the power pop world. They didn't stick in one genre. And they were pioneers in that sense. And I'm sure you probably saw it firsthand. I mean, they put out the first rap song to a mass audience. But what I was going to say was, and ask you, who was the architect of that thinking? Was it Chris? Was it Debbie? Who sort of said, we're open to incorporating all these other reggae, hip-hop, Rapture?
Yeah, it's amazing. But the mainstream radio, FM or AM, certainly, it was alien to them. And middle-class America was really afraid of that, and mass American culture was afraid of that. So here they just slid that in, and it showed the verbal facility. But Debbie knew, they just had a sense, we can get under people's skins with this. And Chris was smart enough to go with that. Jimmy, he had an adaptability. At that stage, for sure, there was never a ton of jealousy in the band. They realized they could bootstrap each other in a really helpful way. And then it's just bewitching to hear coming out of your car radio, like, listen to her, she talks like an auctioneer.
That would have been the first time that white audiences would have heard that.
I really think so. Yeah.
Give us 5 words to describe Debbie Harry and Chris Stein.
Okay. Chris, brooding, intelligent, plain-spoken. In place of plain-spoken, I'd say frank, perhaps. Breezy, and nobody's fool. Debbie, nobody's fool. Conveys an intimacy that's not about you, but about how observant she is. I would say observant. She reads the room. She reads whoever she's talking to. So I would say there's something like canny in there. Pleasant. I have to say pleasant. You could ask her a pretty dumb question, and she goes, oh, I don't know about that, but then she would give you some sort of an answer. So maybe cordial is the word. I said magnetic, so charismatic is sort of gilding the lily. And I would also say gifted. She was born for this, and she had the sense to realize it. So that's a gift. So gifted is not an empty compliment.
Blondie album that was poorly received, 1982's The Hunter. It has a couple songs, War Child, Island of Lost Souls. Next, the world of Blondie comes crashing down with a series of incidences related to economics and a mysterious disease that strikes a key member of the band. By the early 1980s, Blondie were financially strained despite global success. Much of this came down to the way the music industry worked at the time. Record labels would advance money for recording, touring, and promotion, but then recoup those costs from the band's earnings before the artist saw significant profit. So even hit records didn't always translate into immediate personal income. Blondie were at their commercial peak, But Debbie Harry and Chris Stein have both described the pressures of fame, touring, and burnout in the New York scene. For example, in the 1978 to 82 stretch, they released 5 albums in 5 years. On the road, that output translated into multiple near-continuous touring cycles, effectively a major tour tied to each album, including extensive US, UK, European, and global runs during their peak years, especially 1979-80 after Heart of Glass and Parallel Lines broke them worldwide. So in practical terms, it was roughly 5 albums and 4 to 5 major touring pushes in about 4 years, which is why burnout became such a defining part of the band's story by the early 1980s. Debbie Harry and Chris Stein described periods of heavy heroin use tied to the burnout. Chris has described the pair at this point as functioning addicts. They eventually entered treatment in the mid-1980s and got clean. At the height of Blondie's success in the early 80s, here's Chris hospitalized for 3 months with something called pemphigus vulgaris, a rare, potentially fatal autoimmune disease that causes severe blistering. And the illness forced the band to go on extended hiatus while his partner Debbie put her own career on hold. As the band collapsed in 1982 and Stein became seriously ill, their drug use intensified during a period of extreme stress and instability. Harry later wrote that she even smuggled heroin into the hospital to help manage Stein's pain during his treatment, reflecting both caretaking and the troubled dependency they were caught in. I couldn't believe it, like how much she had to nurse him back to health. And then they had to deal with bankruptcy. I mean, do you have any insights on all that?
Just to this extent, first I have to say, you got to admire the loyalty, right? That was stand-up performance by her. And,
Yeah.
you see the rub. So, first of all, kudos to Debbie. Without Chris, Debbie was a little rootless because he was the one who would go say, no, we're going to stay till midnight and we're going to get this, right? And we're going to pay 3 times union rate for the engineers to hang around because we're going to make this happen. He was the make it happen guy. So my insight is just, it makes their story so human that she would give up her time. So it's a story. What became is not so raw ambition, but, a convincing desire to make it lasted. And it lasted out of plain old human love.
And then basically they went through bankruptcy. They couldn't afford medical bills. She's nursing him. They didn't have any money. I mean, the whole thing just crashed down on them. And yet, you're right. She showed that loyalty in nursing him back to health. Just an incredible story. I mean, that should be a movie.
It really should, because her story is a pretty cool story.
It's interesting that this group comes back with a reunion album with 4 original members: Deborah, Chris Stein, Jimmy Destry, and Clem Burke.
Yeah.
And in February 99, they come out with No Exit, and Maria becomes a hit for them. #1 in the UK. Their 6th #1 in the UK. My goodness. They've had one in 3 different decades. That was a huge hit.
I'm really glad you bring that up, because it'd been 20 years, just about 20 years, since they were effectively in the marketplace or had been in the studio in a really productive way.
Yeah.
I was just listening to that song again this morning. It's so layered. It's so smartly engineered and produced. There's plenty of information at every sonic level, and yet it's very poppy, pop rocky. They just blended it into this irresistible pop hit. So again, that was a ballsy effort and produced just the intended effect. It was a high point for sure.
The legacy of this band, their influence stretches across, well, new wave, modern pop, probably how to package a group in terms of what you said earlier, their media savvy ways. What do you think their most overlooked contribution to rock history is?
I think they showed that if you have a compelling front person and you have musicians tuned in enough to the entire band's thrust and image to make that front person stand out without dominating too much. Thus the phrase, Blondie is the band. That you knew that came straight out of Chris and Debbie to the marketing department. Blondie is the band. Yes. And don't mess with our sister, Don't make her an ornament, don't make her a, some kind of cheap imaginary incel date. She's a fully fledged songwriter, musician. This is her husband sometimes, who totally believes in her. When you know you've got a locomotive of a front person, you feature that. And any band can learn from that.
Sure. I wonder if it influenced Pat Benatar and Neil Giraldo. Benatar was sort of a well-packaged front person relative, videos loved her. And then Neil was the guitar hero guy. And that seems to almost be a model based on Blondie.
Oh, sure. In fact, they were on the road with the Blondies.
Fred, give us a hit you still love of Blondie and maybe a deeper cut we should listen to for our homework.
Yeah, well, the one I now want to look up, and I will report to you and send it to you. I'm Gonna Love You Too by Buddy Holly. I think I can find a live rendition of that, maybe. So I'm fascinated to hear that. You know, I bug my wife. Sometimes I'll be singing Ripper to Shreds while I'm doing the dishes. She goes,
That's off the first album.
yeah, I know. Oh, I played that album. Talk about wearing out your vinyl. Here she comes now. You know her, Miss Groupie Supreme. So that's autobiographical. They saw some chick at CBGB's probably talking to Chris. Excuse the use of term chick. I'd like to just be riding along on a long drive and listen to In the Flesh and listen to her croon that, There's an erotic element to her performances. You feel a depth of eroticism. So I think In the Flesh might reward In the Right Mood.
Today we've been talking to Fred Schruers. He was one of the original Rolling Stone writers who was on the beat and following the scene at CBGB's and wrote a book on Blondie, which is a telling tale of their early days and hints at a lot of the things we talked about today, which is how these group of people became massive stars, packaged their brand, and ultimately combined the incredible innovations across a bunch of different genres with the packaging of an amazing front woman and a guitar man that formed their own partnership within that's quite compelling. Thank you for being on the show today.
My pleasure. Great questions as always, Dave. Thank you.
You can also follow us on Instagram, X, and other social platforms for daily music history insights delivered straight to your feed. And follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube to stay up to date when our new episodes drop. Thanks to our production crew, Scott Campbell, Chad Raymond, Amelia Marianne, and Nigel Campbell. I'm Dave Anthony. Thanks for listening. Join us next time for another Garage to Stadium story.